Hey guys, tonight we begin with a journey back to ancient Greece. Not the shiny version from movies, not the version where everyone looks like a marble statue who spends their afternoons discussing philosophy while dramatically staring at the sea. No. Tonight we're looking at ancient Greece from the perspective of the average person, the mortal, the farmer, the fisherman, the shepherd, the exhausted mother trying to keep 6 children alive, the guy whose entire future depends on whether a goat decides to wander off a cliff. So dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe grab a blanket, and let's slowly drift into a world where the gods were powerful, the cities were beautiful, and daily life was quite often absolutely miserable. Now, when people imagine ancient Greece, they usually picture greatness, great thinkers, great warriors, great temples, great art, and to be fair, all of those things existed, but most people were not philosophers. Most people were not generals. Most people were definitely not living in giant palaces. Most people spent their lives working, and then doing a little extra work just to make things interesting. Imagine waking up before sunrise every day. There are no alarm clocks, no coffee makers, no heated homes, no comfortable mattresses. You wake because the sun is coming up, because your animals are making noise, or because your life depends on squeezing every possible hour of labor out of the day. You probably sleep on a simple mat. Your house is small. It is dark. It is smoky. It is crowded. And depending on your financial situation, several goats may have a closer relationship with your living room than you would prefer. Of course, the goats don't care. They're having a wonderful time. Ancient Greece was not one unified country. It was a collection of city-states. Places like Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and Thebes. Each had its own government, its own laws, its own military, and occasionally its own opinion that the neighboring city should be violently reminded who was in charge. This meant wars happened quite frequently. If you were a regular citizen, that was unfortunate, because governments have a tendency to need soldiers whenever they decide to start arguing with each other. And ancient arguments often involve spears. Lots of spears. Now let's talk about food, because food controlled almost everything. The average Greek diet was simple, very simple. Bread, olives, cheese, wine, some vegetables, maybe fish if you lived near the coast. Meat was much rarer than people often imagine. For many families, meat was a luxury, something reserved for festivals or special occasions. You weren't sitting down to giant feasts every evening. Most days were considerably less exciting. In fact, if modern social media influencers had to survive on the average Greek diet for a month, there would probably be emotional support groups by week 2. Agriculture was difficult. Greek soil wasn't especially generous. Large parts of the landscape were rocky, hilly, dry. The environment looked beautiful. The farmers were less impressed. Every harvest carried risks. Too much rain, not enough rain, unexpected frost, crop disease, animal problems, insects, a neighboring army marching through your fields because diplomacy had once again failed. And if your crops failed, well, good luck. There were no supermarkets, no food delivery apps, no emergency relief programs, no customer support department. There was just reality, a reality that occasionally informed people they would be eating significantly less this year. Then there were diseases. Ancient medicine was, let's call it, enthusiastic. Doctors existed. Some were surprisingly skilled. Others were essentially guessing with confidence. which, if we're being honest, remains a timeless human tradition. People believed health depended on balancing bodily fluids called humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. If something went wrong, treatments could become creative. And by creative, I mean unpleasant. Imagine feeling sick. You visit someone claiming medical expertise. They examine you, think deeply, and conclude that removing blood from your body might solve the problem. Because obviously, what a weakened patient needs is less blood. The logic was questionable. The confidence was impressive. Life expectancy was also much lower than today. Many children never reached adulthood. Many women died during childbirth. Infections that modern medicine handles relatively easily could become deadly. A small injury could become a major problem. A tooth infection could become a life-threatening crisis, which makes every modern dentist appointment feel slightly less annoying. Only slightly. Now let's discuss religion. Because religion touched every part of Greek life. The gods were everywhere, literally everywhere. Every storm, every harvest, every illness, every victory, every defeat, every strange event, every piece of good luck, every piece of bad luck. The gods were involved, or at least people believed they were. This created a rather stressful relationship between mortals and divine beings. Greek gods were powerful. They were fascinating. They were also, unfortunately, unpredictable. Very unpredictable. Imagine worshipping beings who routinely transformed people into animals, started wars, created monsters, issued curses, and occasionally ruined lives over personal grudges. The gods in Greek mythology were not exactly known for emotional stability. Zeus alone generated enough drama to keep several modern therapists employed indefinitely. A mortal's position was clear. Stay respectful, make sacrifices, follow traditions, and hope no deity suddenly develops an interest in your existence. Because in Greek myths, that rarely ended well. Sometimes people asked for blessings. Sometimes they received them. Sometimes they received a complicated lesson about humility instead. Ancient Greeks also relied heavily on oracles. These were individuals believed to communicate divine messages. The most famous was the Oracle of Delphi. People traveled enormous distances seeking answers. Kings came, generals came, ordinary people came. Everyone wanted guidance. The problem was that oracle predictions were often remarkably vague. You know the type. The kind of advice that sounds profound until you realize it could mean almost anything. A king might ask whether he should invade another kingdom. The oracle would respond with something mysterious. The king would leave feeling enlightened. Then 6 months later, he'd realize the prophecy technically predicted his own disaster. Ancient Greece was basically operating with cosmic customer service that specialized in ambiguity. And yet people kept coming back. Now, let's float over to family life. Because family was everything. Households were large. Responsibilities were shared. Children began working young, very young. There was no extended adolescence, no gap year, no leisurely self-discovery journey. Children learned skills quickly because survival required it. Boys often trained for labor, farming, military service, or trade. Girls usually learned domestic responsibilities. Everyone contributed. Because there wasn't much room for freeloading when food supplies depended on collective effort. Marriage often happened earlier than modern people expect, particularly for women. Love was not always the primary consideration. Family alliances, property, social position, practical concerns often mattered more. Romantic comedies had not yet conquered human civilization. Now let's visit Sparta, because whenever people hear ancient Greece, someone inevitably brings up Sparta. Sparta was famous for discipline, military training, toughness, and making childhood considerably more intense than it needed to be. Spartan boys entered military-focused training at a young age. Life became structured around preparing warriors. The system was effective. It was also exhausting. Modern parents sometimes worry about busy school schedules. Spartan children would probably have found those concerns adorable. Spartan society prioritized strength and endurance. Comfort ranked much lower on the list. Much lower. Somewhere beneath not getting stabbed. Athens, meanwhile, offered a different experience. Athens emphasized education, culture, politics, debate, philosophy, which sounds wonderful, unless you were one of the many people excluded from political participation. Democracy existed, but not everyone got to enjoy it. Women generally could not vote. Enslaved people certainly could not vote. Foreign residents often lacked political rights. The famous democracy was real. It was simply more limited than modern audiences sometimes imagine. Still, Athenians loved arguing. They argued about politics. They argued about philosophy. They argued about ethics. They argued about everything. If ancient Athens had internet comment sections, civilization might never have recovered. And through all of this, ordinary people kept working, planting crops, repairing houses, raising families, paying taxes, serving in wars, making sacrifices, praying for good harvests, trying to avoid disease, trying to avoid starvation, trying to avoid becoming collateral damage in someone else's political ambitions. Which brings us to one of the strangest realities of ancient Greece. Despite all the hardship, despite all the uncertainty, despite all the risks, people still found joy. They celebrated festivals. They attended religious ceremonies. They watched athletic competitions. They shared meals. They told stories. They laughed. They fell in love. They made friends. They built communities. Human beings have always been surprisingly stubborn about finding happiness, even in difficult circumstances. And perhaps that's one of the most remarkable parts of the story, because ancient Greece produced extraordinary achievements. But those achievements rested on the shoulders of countless ordinary people, farmers, craftsmen, sailors, mothers, workers, people whose names history forgot. People who spent their lives navigating a world filled with uncertainty. A world where gods controlled storms. Kings started wars. Doctors experimented confidently. And goats wandered wherever they pleased. As we slowly settle into the night, remember that while ancient Greece gave us philosophy, democracy, literature, and art, it also gave millions of ordinary mortals a daily challenge simply called survival. And for many of them, getting through one more year was achievement enough. So close your eyes. Listen to the distant sound of waves along the Aegean coast. Watch the olive trees sway in the evening breeze, and imagine another tired farmer ending another long day, unaware that thousands of years later, people would remember the civilization he helped build, even if they never remembered his name. Story 2. Boring Greek myths for sleep. The surprisingly dark punishments of the Greek gods. Now that we've spent some time with the ordinary mortals of ancient Greece, let's slowly wander into another corner of their world. A much stranger corner. A place where divine beings possessed unlimited power, unlimited confidence, and very limited emotional maturity. Because tonight, we're talking about the punishments of the Greek gods. And if there is one lesson that appears again and again in Greek mythology, It is this: do not upset the gods. Do not accidentally upset the gods. Do not unknowingly upset the gods. And definitely do not become famous enough for a god to notice you, because once a deity became personally interested in your life, things tended to deteriorate rather quickly. The strange thing is that many of these punishments feel wildly disproportionate. A mortal would make one mistake, sometimes not even a very serious mistake, and a god would respond with the kind of overreaction that would make an internet comment section seem reasonable. Let's begin with one of the most famous examples. A man named Tantalus. Tantalus had it pretty good. He was wealthy, powerful, favored by the gods. In some stories, he was even invited to dine with them. Imagine receiving personal invitations to divine banquets. Most people would probably appreciate the opportunity. Tantalus, however, decided that being close to the gods wasn't enough. He apparently wanted to test them, because that always ends well. According to the myth, he committed a terrible crime and attempted to deceive the gods. The details vary depending on the version. Greek myths often function like ancient group projects, where everyone contributed slightly different information. Regardless of the specifics, the gods were not amused, and their punishment was unforgettable. Tantalus was sent to the underworld. There he stood in a pool of water. Whenever he bent down to drink, the water disappeared. Above him hung fruit from tree branches. Whenever he reached for food, the branches moved away, forever thirsty, forever hungry, forever unable to satisfy either need. It was such a memorable punishment that the English word tantalize eventually came from his story, which is an impressive level of historical branding. Most people leave behind a family name. Tantalus left behind an eternal vocabulary word, and honestly, not the sort anyone would choose. Now let's drift over to another unfortunate figure, Sisyphus. Perhaps the hardest working man in mythology, not by choice. Sisyphus was known for his cleverness. The gods might have used a different word, something closer to annoyingly clever. He repeatedly outsmarted divine beings. He manipulated situations. He escaped consequences. He kept finding ways around problems. The gods eventually reached a conclusion. This man was becoming exhausting. Their solution was simple: eternal labor. In the underworld, Sisyphus was forced to push a massive boulder up a hill, every day, every hour, every moment, and each time he neared the top, the boulder rolled back down. Then he started again, forever. No reward, no completion, no progress, just endless repetition. Which sounds suspiciously similar to answering work emails, only with more rocks. Greek audiences immediately understood the horror. Ancient life involved constant labor. The idea of working endlessly without accomplishing anything was genuinely terrifying. Even today, thousands of years later, people still use the phrase Sisyphean task, a tribute to one man's eternal workplace nightmare. Next comes poor Ixion. And poor is perhaps the wrong word, because Ixion created most of his own problems. Like many figures in Greek mythology, he received opportunities, second chances, even divine hospitality, and then proceeded to make spectacularly bad decisions. At one point, he developed inappropriate feelings towards Zeus's wife, Hera. This was already a terrible idea. Attempting to pursue the queen of the gods ranks surprisingly high on the list of actions likely to produce negative outcomes. Zeus discovered the situation, and the punishment was memorable. Ixion was bound to a fiery spinning wheel, which rotated endlessly through eternity. Imagine making one catastrophic social mistake and being sentenced to become permanent amusement park equipment. Greek mythology possessed a unique talent for turning embarrassment into eternal suffering. Of course, some punishments weren't reserved for criminals. Sometimes people simply had terrible luck. Let's quietly visit the story of Actaeon, a hunter, a skilled outdoorsman, someone who likely expected his biggest problems to involve wild animals. Instead, he encountered a goddess, specifically Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. In one version of the myth, Actaeon accidentally saw Artemis bathing. Notice that word, accidentally. He wasn't plotting, he wasn't spying. He simply happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Unfortunately for him, divine beings rarely accepted honest mistakes. Artemis transformed him into a deer, which was unfortunate. But things became considerably more unfortunate. His own hunting dogs no longer recognized him, and they chased him. The hunter became the hunted. A deeply poetic lesson, also a deeply unfair lesson. Ancient Greek myths often contain both at the same time. Now let's slow down and talk about Arachne, because hers is one of the most famous stories involving pride. Arachne was a talented weaver, extremely talented. The problem began when she started claiming that her skills exceeded those of Athena. Athena, being the goddess associated with wisdom and crafts, took this personally, very personally. A contest followed, and depending on the version, Arachne's work was either equal to Athena's or astonishingly good, which sounds impressive, until you remember who the opponent was. The contest ended badly. Athena became angry. Arachne was transformed into a spider, forever weaving, forever creating webs, forever serving as a warning about excessive pride. Although one suspects that becoming a spider may have been less stressful than interacting with offended Olympian deities, let's be honest, the gods were not particularly easy supervisors. Another recurring theme in Greek mythology was transformation. The gods loved transformations. Someone displeased a deity. Transformation. Someone witnessed the wrong thing. Transformation. Someone became too attractive. Transformation. Someone became too successful. Believe it or not, transformation. Entire forests could apparently be populated by people who had annoyed divine beings. One moment you're having a normal afternoon. The next moment you're a bird, or a tree, or a flower. Greek mythology approached problem solving with remarkable creativity and an alarming lack of restraint. What makes these stories interesting isn't just the punishments themselves, it's what they reveal about ancient fears. The Greeks worried about arrogance, about disrespect, about crossing invisible boundaries, about angering forces beyond human control. Life already felt uncertain. Storms destroyed crops. Disease appeared unexpectedly. Wars erupted. Ships vanished at sea. The myths provided explanations, sometimes frightening explanations, but explanations nonetheless. If disaster struck, perhaps a god was involved. Perhaps someone had violated an important rule. Perhaps divine justice was unfolding. Or perhaps Zeus was simply having another difficult day, which happened quite frequently. The king of the gods possessed tremendous authority. He also generated tremendous amounts of drama, a combination that rarely produces stability. As we continue drifting through these stories, a pattern emerges. The punishments are rarely quick, rarely simple, rarely temporary. Greek gods preferred symbolism. If someone was greedy, their punishment reflected greed. If someone was arrogant, their punishment reflected arrogance. If someone attempted deception, the consequences often mirrored the deception itself. The punishments became stories, the stories became lessons, and the lessons survived for thousands of years. Though admittedly, some lessons boiled down to try not to attract the attention of immortal beings. which remains fairly practical advice. Imagine being an ordinary Greek, listening to these myths beside a fire. The message would have been clear. Be respectful. Know your place.